Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.19 and in this lesson we're going to pick up from where we left off and we're going to categorize the remainder of the effects that come bundled with Bitwig Studio inside of our three categories here that we've already defined. These three categories coincide with some of the principles of sound that we've already talked about. So we have time or duration, amplitude, and frequency. So I'm not going to get too in depth as to how I'm doing this, but I want you guys to just watch and see how I'm making these decisions, how there are certain parameters that I'm going to notice, and immediately I'm going to know where I need to drop these effects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up the effects onto the raw channel. I'm going to mess around with the parameters a little bit, going back with one of these samples that we have here inside of our audio channel. And then once I decide where I want to put it, I'm going to place it inside of that effects layer on sort of a new chain. So we have this delay here, the delay one, and by the end of this, we're going to have multiple chains going down with all of the effects that fall into that category. At the end of the video, I'll show you the Word document that I created where I've actually gone ahead and just listed out where all of these effects fall. And I'll give you guys time if you want to copy this down. You can obviously pause the video. And then we're going to save our different effects layers so that we can always go back to them to know where these particular, where any of the particular effects falls in relation to our three categories. So let's get started. I'm not going to talk about any of these effects in great depth, but you're going to see, like I said, that there are parameters that are going to be similar amongst a variety of these effects, and that's going to help us in determining where we're going to place them. I'm not going to use the span in this example, but when we go through and start to mess with these effects one-on-one, at that point, we will probably bring up the span quite a bit. So let's get started and we'll begin with the bit 8 here. So I'm just going to go ahead and click play and just mess around a little bit, see what we can come up with. Okay, so obviously this is having an effect on the frequency spectrum. We actually have a frequency control right here, and you can hear as I bring this down, we're affecting the lower frequencies. As we bring it up, it's starting to affect some of those higher frequencies. We can set just how much distortion is happening here with the bit controls and our gate parameter as well. So I'm going to go into the frequency domain here, and I'm going to add a new chain, and I'm going to put in the bit 8. Perfect. Let's go on to the next one now. I'm going to delete this bit 8. Let's bring up the next one. The blur here. All right, and right away, I already know where this is going to go because we have these time parameters. Once you see milliseconds, you know that we're going to probably be messing with delay. So let's take a listen, see what we can come up with here. Yeah, it's pretty obvious that that's having an effect on our time domain of the sound. So let's go into time duration, go up here, and we're going to add the blur. Moving on, we're going to have our chorus effect next. And look at that, we see another time parameter right there. So I'm, for right now, just going to turn off this LFO, and let's see what we can come up with. Again, the chord is going to be a good one to use when we're testing out this effect. The sine, maybe as well, would be useful for this. Let's mix this in more. See if we can find a sweet spot. And then we could add some LFO if we wanted to as well. So although the time is very subtle that's being delayed, you can actually see it here. It goes as low as 3 milliseconds up to 40 milliseconds. It's still taking our signal and it's slightly pushing it off. Okay, so even though it's very subtle, this is still going to fall into our time and duration. Does it have an impact on the frequency spectrum? It absolutely does, but the emphasis here is that we are adjusting the time domain to get those changes. So let's go into our time duration, and we're going to add the chorus just like that. Let's move on. Let's try to go a bit quicker through these. I encourage you guys to do this on your own as well. Here's our comb. Let's take a listen, and we have a frequency control here, so my guess is this is going to be impacting the frequency spectrum in some way. For sure. Lower frequencies. All right, so you can see there on the span how our comb effect, which is actually a comb filter, is impacting that. So we're going to go to frequency here, and let's add in the comb. Okay, up next we have the compressor. So let's see what controls we have on there. All right, I'm seeing a threshold control, a ratio control, and an attack and release. So we've talked about the attack and release and how that normally corresponds to the amplitude envelope. Not all the time, but for our purposes, it typically has. And so my guess is this is probably going to impact our amplitude. And let's see what we can get. I might do this on the drum loop. Our little blue icon there showing us just how much gain reduction is occurring. Do some heavy compression. Try to let that kick snap through. Make it bouncy. Okay, so this one is obviously impacting our amplitude envelope or the amplitude over time. So you can hear when we really compress it hard, we're getting a lot of gain reduction. If I don't have makeup gain on, which I really don't encourage you to ever use makeup gain, you can hear just how much we're taking away. But you'll see that there's just not quite as much movement as in the original signal. So this is our original signal here on the left, and this is our process signal here on the right. So if I bring up the output here and try to match it, you can see that the amount that it's jumping from low to high isn't quite as much, and that's what the compressor is doing. It's reducing the dynamic range, which means you can turn it up louder without actually getting any distortion. This isn't the best sounding compressor in the world, though. You could hear when we had very short attack and release times, you could hear the compressor really struggling to try to handle these very percussive sounds. So that is something to be aware of. Let's go into the amplitude here, and we're going to add the compressor on. There we go. And we can move on to our next effect. Now, we've already done the delay 1, so we'll move on to the delay 2. And surprise, surprise, the delay 2 is going to be doing exactly what the delay 1 does, only now we have independent control over our left and right channel. Again, we have these filters, which for right now, I'm just going to blur out. Let's put the mix up, and let's take a listen to this using, I don't know, let's use those sine short stabs. See what happens if we just get two very close numbers. Widen this out. Just the delays with the original signal. We're probably not going to really hear that vibrato right now, but that's okay. All right, so obviously this is going to go into our time and duration category. I'm sorry, I keep playing around with these longer than I should. I have a lot of fun with these. Next, we have our distortion. So let's go back to our raw. Let's load up the distortion. This will be a good one to show with the span going. Let's use, we'll use the snare just for fun. So let's turn the mix all the way down. And just watch the frequency content here as I bring this in. Let's see, let's up the drive. Maybe this will be better on the chord. Okay, so just watch how this frequency content is changing as I pull this up. Obviously, we're going into the reds there. You got to be careful if you push these too far. This effect can either be very, very subtle, or you can really, really push it. So obviously this one is going to fall into our frequency category. So let's go over to frequency and we're going to add distortion there. Up next, we have dynamics, and obviously that's going to fall into our amplitude category, you would guess, because we've talked about amplitude and dynamics, how those are really one and the same. And again, we could go through and use the drum loop or, play any of these. We could actually do it with just a single hit as well. If we want to specifically compress or expand the snare, we could do that. And we actually have two settings here. We have a loud and we have a quiet. Now, when you're going to use the loud, it's going to act like a normal compressor. And so once this is breached, it's going to start to compress the dynamic range. When you're using the quiet, which is just another word of saying expander, you can see that it actually goes in the opposite direction there. And we'll talk all about that a little bit later, but for now we're more familiar with compression, so that's what we're going to use with this snare hit. So let's go, I don't know, we'll go something pretty steep. We also have a knee control here, which is going to determine just how sharp this this transition is into the curve here where our threshold is set. So you can see the threshold if I bring it down, if I bring it up, we're really going hard on this. Let's do something a little bit easier. Let's really make this sharp. Let's see, where are our attack and release? Let's just try to get that little hit. There we go. Now we can add some output, try to match it. Now we should have a punchier sounding snare. Maybe add a little more release. Heavy duty compression. Okay, so we know where that's going to go. We're going to drop that into our amplitude category here. Which one was that? Dynamics. Okay, the next ones are all kind of the same, so we'll just load these up at the same time. Our EQ2, our EQ5, and our EQ DJ. All three of these are going to be impacting the frequency spectrum. Now you're going to say, isn't it also messing with amplitude as well? Because if we're playing back like our drum loop and we kill the lows, Obviously, we've just lost a lot of amplitude, but of course, you can always go back and turn it up later if you want to do that. And on some of these, we actually will have an output control. So I'm just going to turn this one off, go into the EQ DJ, and I'm going to do kind of a similar thing. We'll take our first one, high pass filter. So if I turn this off and turn it back on, you're going to hear we've lost some gain. But I can always make up for that here. Okay, so that's why this one is going to fall into the frequency category and not the amplitude category, because its main focus is, again, on our frequency content on the spectrum. So we'll go into frequency, and we'll just add all of those in here. Am I allowed to pull this up? No. EQ2, EQ5, EQ DJ. Perfect. And again, the only difference between those is that with our EQ DJ, we have three points at which we can adjust the frequency content. So we have our low frequency content, which in this case is from like 20 to 420, our mid, which is from 420 to 2.7K, and then our high, which is 2.7 up to like 20,000, up to 20 kilohertz. Okay, and if we have the EQ2, obviously that's referring to the fact that we have two places where we can impact the frequency spectrum using either bells or using high pass or low pass, and the EQ5 exactly the same as the EQ2, only we have 5 points versus 2. Okay, moving on to our next effect, we have a filter. Oh, surprise, surprise, the filter is going to be very similar to our EQ. We can play this out with the drum loop here. You don't even hear anything. We can kill the lows again if we want. Have this little resonance. We can find the right point, do some fun stuff with it. Obviously, I have way too much fun with that. So we'll put that into our frequency category as well. Let's go on to the flanger. And we'll use the chord for this, why not? Now this one can be a little bit deceiving. Mainly because it's working really hard on the frequency content. But again, the actual flange setting itself comes from this timing setting. And you can see we have from 0.25, which our chorus started at 0.10, and this one goes up to 27.5, where our chorus went up much, much higher than that. So this one is going to fall into the time and duration, but just like the chorus, it also is playing a pretty heavy role on the frequency spectrum. So let's just mess around with this a little while. Make it wide. Oh yeah. You can adjust the feedback. And again, the big thing that's playing on this is this time parameter right here. That's what's giving us those differences in timbres that we're able to generate. So we'll go ahead and put this into our time and duration category. And the next one should be obvious as well. It is a frequency shifter. So that's going to obviously mess with our frequency content. Let's do this with the chord as well. You can hear how this shift is related to our range. So we're taking that area of frequency and either bring it way down or bring it up. Pretty cool. We could actually duplicate this and then impact the left and right differently. Just bring both these up 100%. There we go. And remember, this is actually what we started with. We've gotten it to this. Just with 2 instances of a frequency shifter. Very cool. So we're going to go ahead and drop this into our frequency category. Now we can move on, and now that we kind of are familiar with all the parameters, we can power through these pretty quick. We have a gate, and a gate is, we have a threshold control, we have an attack and release. So what's that going to cue to us immediately? It's going to cue to us amplitude, and you can just listen to hear what this is capable of doing. So we've essentially been able to pull out our hi-hat from that pattern. And we also, when we hit the cymbal at the start, we're able to get it to get a bit of a stutter. So it's pretty obvious what's going on there with the gate. That's one of those examples in effect that you really have to hear versus explain. And we'll move into the amplitude here and just drop the gate in there as well. We'll talk about some creative uses of the gate a little bit later on in this series. As we're going to talk about creative uses of all these effects. I'm not sure what I'm talking about. Next up, we have the ladder. The ladder is very similar to the filter, only it gives us a few additional controls, but at its most basic, it's just giving us a variety of filters that we can work with. So we'll play through the chord maybe, and just mess with a couple of these so you can hear what we can come up with. Our low passes, our high passes, our band passes, peak notch, and a couple of other fun filters. We have an LFO built in. See if I can get something cool. Okay, pretty cool. Again, I need to stop just going crazy and experimenting with all of these, but again, it's a filter, so we're going to drop it into our frequency category here, and that was called the ladder. We're already familiar with what the limiter does. I don't really think I have to go over it again, but I'll just open it up and show you how we can bring up the level of this drum loop. Of course, we could use the limiter in conjunction with like a gate. So if we want to gate out the hi-hat and then still bring up the overall level, we could do that. But for now, let's just use the limiter by itself. And here we go. And again, you see a gain control. So obviously, we're going to be going with amplitude. We also have a release control. Let's get this to be kind of punchy. Again, this isn't the greatest limiter in the world. Still getting that feedback. Yeah, I may not recommend you guys use this limiter on your dance music, but still, it's a very powerful tool, especially at the end when we're just trying to bring the volume up on everything like we've talked about with our last creation project. So I'm just going to drop this into amplitude. We're almost done. We just have 6 or 7 more to go. So maybe if you want to take a coffee break, go for it. But I'm going to keep moving on here. And next up, we have the Resonator bank. I already know that resonance is something that is typically associated with filters. So my guess is this is also going to work on the frequency content. This is a pretty cool one. You can get some really crazy timbres out of this. I might even just run through the presets so you can hear what you can get. But let's just take a listen to this. Oh my goodness. Oh wow, that's awesome. Oh wow. So cool. Let's try some of these presets out. That sounds awesome. Add some reverb on the end of that. So cool, so cool. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and drop this one into the frequency. You can see that once you start to learn these effects, it just makes logical sense what you're gonna put on top of the other. And we talked about the delay. We didn't talk about the reverb yet, but you'll notice that following a frequency change, I jumped in and put a time and duration change on right after that. So you're gonna find that a lot of times combinations within a certain category, although they might work and they're gonna add onto each other, sometimes it makes a lot of sense to just pull one from each category. But we'll talk more about that much later. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the Resonator bank on there. Next up, we have the reverb. You guys got a little taste of that. The reverb's a pretty tough one in terms of where you're gonna put it, because the reverb really has an effect on everything. But the reverb is working with time for the most part. And really what the reverb is, especially these algorithmic reverbs, is just a ton of small delays. And that's why it's usually the most processor heavy effect in your arsenal, because it's taking your signal and it's delaying it millions and millions of times into these tiny little echoes until you come up with this reverb. And reverb is really just another way of simulating a space. So if you think about a space in general, if I clap my hands in this room, that clap is bouncing off of all the walls. So I am getting a bunch of little delays that are coming back to me at different times. And that's what a reverb is going to simulate. But we can hear some of the beautiful sounds that we can get out of this reverb. Maybe we'll just go to the presets because some of them are pretty nice. Put this up to like 45. Some of these are very, very subtle right now. But you can also hear how much of a difference this is making to the frequency spectrum as well. Something really wet. Okay, we can drop that into our time and duration category, since I already explained how that's working. But that one is tough. I could understand why you'd want to maybe put that into the frequency category as well. Speaking of the frequency category, let's open up our ring modulator here and see what exactly is going on, or I should say listen to what's happening. You can hear that at certain settings we're also actually making an amplitude change, but that's not really its main function. The purpose of this is to impact the frequency spectrum. All right, so we'll drop that into frequency. Up next, we have what's referred to as the Rotary, but really the Rotary is just another way of saying auto pan. So this one's going to be working with the amplitude for the most part. We have an amp section here, and for me, when there's something that's messing specifically with panning, I usually put that into the amplitude section. That's just how I do it because we have our pan control and we have our volume fader, so it makes the most sense to me. Let's use the drum loop for this. Hopefully you guys can hear that and speed up. You can see it as well up here. And so I'm going to drop that one into amplitude. We've already talked about the tool, so we don't need to look at that one again. We put that one into amplitude, the easiest one of all. Transient control is a little bit tricky, but we have these attack and we have these sustain parameters. So it's not going to surprise you that this is going to go into the amplitude category again. We've seen attack and release or decay settings on our compressor and on our dynamics control. So this is going to fall in with that same category of effects, and we'll just listen to what it can do. Maybe I'll mess with it on the snare. Let's boost the attack portion. Whoa, hear how much punch that gives it? Gives it a lot of additional gain as well. I can even kill the sustain on it. So now we're just getting that click basically. Or I can boost the sustain, drop the attack. All right, that's going to be very helpful when you're working with percussion, whether your own sounds or samples you find. A little bit of transient control on that, or even on an entire drum loop, for example. That's a little extreme. Just a little bit of that. We're losing some of that punch. We want a little bit more punch. It's easier than a compressor, but just as powerful. So we're going to drop that into our amplitude section. And last but not least, we have tremolo. Don't get tremolo confused with vibrato. Tremolo is an amplitude variation, while vibrato is a frequency variation. And I'm just going to bring that in, and it's just going to repeat. And you see we have a rate control here, a depth control, and I'm just going to play this back using probably the chord again. Who needs sidechain compression when you have the tremolo effect, right? You can add a little bit of randomness. Using the sample and hold circuit. And this one's going to fall into the amplitude category as well. So one last thing I wanted to talk about, just in case there is somebody from Bitwig watching this, or if one of you guys knows one of the developers, something that would be really handy, I think, is if we had the ability from our macro controls to convert these into buttons. So right now we can change it to bipolar and we can change it to just normal, but I think having a button here, like an on-off switch, would be really helpful. So for example, if we're working with the tremolo here right now, I don't have a way of turning this on and off from the macro stage unless I turn off the entire effects layer. But let's say that I have my tremolo, my compressor, and a bunch of other things going, and I want to just sort of alternate which effect is going on at any given time. Having buttons here, I think, would be super helpful. Now, that's not a feature that's available right now, but I did just think I'd throw that one out there. Of all the things that I've seen Bitwig have, that's one thing that it's lacking that it seems like would make a lot of sense considering all the other stuff they have going on inside their software. I understand it might be kind of tricky to code that because only certain parameters are ever going to be able to be used with buttons, but still, I think that would be quite helpful. And even just having a button to, go from 0 rate to something you set would be pretty cool as well. Last but not least, I just thought I'd show you guys the Word document I created here. Hopefully we can go to full screen. And I went ahead and just labeled everything out. So we'll go back and we're going to save all of our categories. or excuse me, our effects layers, but it still might be helpful to have this in word form. Take it on the bus, look at it, try to, in your head, make connections. So when you see and read the word delay, instantly make that time duration comparison. And then in your head, hopefully you can kind of remember the sound that that delay effect had. I'll just go down a little bit. So if you guys want, you can pause this and you could copy this down, or you can make one on your own. And I've put a couple of notes next to some of these that might be a little more confusing or just to help you out. So our blur is really like a Haas effect because it's starting by isolating the two channels to the left and to the right, and then letting you delay each of those independently if you want. But feel free to go in and experiment further. I'm not going to talk more about that right now. And I'll go down to our other set. Again, you can pause it and take that down. So last but not least, let's go back into Bitwig and let's save these layers that we've just created. So I'll start with my time and my duration, and I'll just go ahead and I'm going to click on the, hopefully I clicked the right thing, save button. And I'm going to call this preset time effects. Leave it inside of the categories. Sure, my name is fine. I don't really feel like there's anything I can tag this with other than effects. And so I will click OK. I'm surprised they don't have like delay and stuff on here. That would be helpful. I can go into Amplitude and I can do the same thing. And then I can move into frequency and do the same thing yet again. Remember, you do have to open up our macro controls to be able to save these presets. And this is frequency FX. So now you have them all saved and sorted. I need to go back in there and add on to the tag later, but I'm not going to do that right now. Hopefully these videos have been helpful for you. You now know how every single effect in Bitwig can be broken up and put into a category with some familiar effects. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you again in the next lesson.